Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Blessings, good evening. We just passed by the anniversary of Luang, our teacher's death, which we commemorate every year at Wat Pah Pong on the 16th of January. But also in another day, we reach the anniversary of the passing away of Ajahn Maha, Luang Maha, who is another of the great forest Ajahns, a contemporary of Luang. And these two monks are very well known in the circle of forest meditation monks in Thailand and maybe now around the world. There are, of course, many other great forest masters, forest meditation masters who have come out of the tradition in Thailand. But perhaps these two, Luang and Luang Maha, are the most well-known, very energetic practitioners themselves, and then very energetic teachers of both Sangha, monks and nuns, and laity. And that's led to them both accumulating many, many students in Thailand and around the world. So in a couple of days we commemorate the passing of Ajahn Maha. He lived a bit longer than Luang. As we know, Luang spent the last 10 years of his life very ill, but still acting as a figurehead or a focus for many people's practice before he died. Ajahn Maha lived longer and was quite energetic teaching right up until very close to his death. His life is quite inspiring, like the life of Luang. You can read or listen to his biography. And similar to Ajahn Chah and many other teachers, Luang Maha displayed many special spiritual qualities or characteristics from an early age. He certainly wasn't perfect when he was born. If you knew him, he would sometimes tell stories of his upbringing, his life as a child and a youth before he was a monk. And in some ways, he was just typical young person in northeast Thailand, brought up in a farming community, so a very poor community. So that taught him how to be very patient and how to endure. Even from a young age, he had to do a lot of hard physical work and endure the poverty of that part of the world. But he was somebody who was very hardworking, diligent, and very sincere in whatever he did. It was one of his personal qualities that even his parents noticed from an early age. They say, whatever our son Bua, they called him Bua, which means lotus. Whatever Bua does, he does it well and he doesn't stop until it's finished. So he got a reputation as a young boy that whenever he worked for his parents on the farm, like say ploughing or planting rice and so on, he would always work long hours and wouldn't rest And occasionally his parents, who were normally leading the family in cultivating their fields and their crops, when they were busy doing other things, they would leave their son Bua in charge of all the other kids, and they had many children. He wasn't the eldest, but they treated him like the eldest because he was so reliable. But when they left him in charge, all the other kids in the family would groan because they knew that day they're going to work harder than when the parents were around. Because when the parents were around, they actually allowed the kids to rest a bit and relax a bit sometimes through the day, whereas the young Bua wouldn't. He'd just work right through from start to finish, and so everyone groaned when he was in charge, because they knew they weren't going to get any rest and they get really tired by the end of the day. But at the same time they would follow him because he was kind, compassionate. He had many leadership qualities from a young age. So like, for instance, he had an elder brother who was not quite as strong or agile as him, or not quite as smart either at schoolwork. He was always helping his brother. For instance, like their father, he said his father was a hunter, which is quite common in those days, because this is 100 years ago. So 85% of Thailand was jungle, full of animals. A lot of them were wild animals, so people were quite scared. They lived in these small village enclaves in the jungle, but surrounded by jungle. So his father was a hunter and gatherer and go out into the jungle regularly to hunt. And one of the things he collected was honey. And they'd find honeybee hives, and then they'd go up the trees to retrieve the honey, which was risky because the bees would get angry and chase and sting them. So they'd usually go at night because the bees were less active at night, so they could steal the honey or take the honey without getting stung. So the father trained his boys to climb trees, and Bua was much better at it than his brother, and he could go up trees quicker and go further and higher. And the way the father trained them, he'd give them a prize for the first one up to the top of the tree. He'd have these little treats of sticky rice. Sticky rice is the staple of northeast Thailand, and he would they'd kind of fry in oil with seasoning, with herbs, the sticky rice, and it was made a tasty treat. So he'd always have one or two of these available, and he'd say, whoever gets up to the top of the tree first will get the sticky rice treat. And Bua was faster and better at it than his brother, but when he came down, he'd win the treat, but then he'd always share it with his brother. And that's how his family remembered him. He's always sharing whatever he had with the others. And they're very poor, so when you have someone who's generous and shares, people appreciate it. And that carried on throughout his youth. Whatever he had, he always shared it with his brothers and sisters, whether it's food or other possessions. There's almost no money in those days, hardly any money in the economy, but other things they would have to share. And he also shared his knowledge. He was very smart, very good at schoolwork, so he would help his brothers and sisters with their schoolwork. In those days, the schools were open air. They wouldn't have walls between the classes. They just had maybe one roof of a thatched roof of grass, and different classes, depending on the age group, sitting cross-legged on the floor listening to a teacher. So one for the sort of 7-year-olds, one for the 8-year-olds, one for the 9-year-olds, and so on. So they're all near each other, and his brother remembered one time the teacher asked his brother a question to explain, I think they're asking him, what is a bat? You know, the animal, the mammal, the bat, what is it? So it's kind of like simple biology. And his brother froze, couldn't answer, didn't have the information, and Bua was in another class sitting, like 10 meters away with another group of kids with another teacher. But he heard this question and he heard his brother wasn't answering. So he said he meditated. He was only a kid, but he meditated sending his brother the answer through his mind. But it didn't work. His brother still couldn't answer. Obviously his meditation wasn't very good yet. So in the end, out of frustration, he just shouted across the school, the groups of kids who were just sitting there. And his brother heard his voice, heard the answer, and gave the answer to the school teacher. So there are many incidents like that where he'd help his brothers and sisters with their work, with physical work, with school work, share things with them. Whatever, he would do whatever he could to help people. So all his family knew that from a young age. He was kind, generous, helpful, and reliable. So by the time he became a young adult, his family really relied on him to lead the family in their farming work. But his father had one wish, like most fathers in northeast Thailand. They want one of their sons to become a monk, because they believe that's great merit for the family, good karma. If one boy becomes a monk, he'll make a lot of good karma and it will bring good fortune to the family. Bua himself, he said he wasn't actually that interested in being a monk, which might surprise you because he's later considered to be an enlightened arahant. But when he was young, he was still doing young people's things, and he would go out to village festivals, the equivalent of parties, chasing the girls, he said. And he liked hanging around with friends, doing things. But he also respected his parents, and he knew the wish of his father was that one of them would become a monk. So he took up that wish of his father and became a monk, ordained. And he said he didn't plan to become a monk for the rest of his life. He just thought he'd do it for a year or two to make some merit for the family, to keep his father happy. But once he was in the robes, he liked it. You can only tell what it's like being a monk or a nun when you do it. You can only imagine if you're on the outside looking in, as it were. You can't really know what it's like. But once you do it, then you really get to understand the life, the renunciant's life. So he became a monk and he took to it. He found a very peaceful, rewarding lifestyle. He was studying. In those days he wasn't yet meditating much, but he was studying the scriptures. So he was learning things and he was living very simply and peacefully. And he reflected that he still had a desire for the family, the married life, and he was engaged to a girl. He was expected to marry this girl when he came out of the monkhood. But living as a monk, he said, he liked the simplicity, being single, living in a hut in the monastery, chanting, studying, meditating. And he thought about it. He thought, why complicate things and go back and start a family? So he just stayed on and didn't disrobe. And he kept studying, and he was good at it. He memorized a lot of the texts in the Pali language, the language of the Buddha. And he passed exams, and he just kept studying for the first maybe 6 years of his life as a monk. He studied and gained proficiency in the Pali language, in the texts, memorized a lot of the Buddha's teachings, and did quite a lot of good, because most other monks weren't there that long. They were temporary and they disrobed, but he stayed. So he was trusted by his teachers. And he said he learned many things. So one of the things he learned was how one of his teachers was very generous with his time and the way he ran the monastery. He never took anything for himself. In any monastery, Many people come every day to offer food and other gifts to the monks, what we call Sanghadana, and they offer these gifts to support the monks, and they go into the monastery. And the way they did it in those days was the monks would always draw lots for the items that were offered. Like someone would offer a cup, or offer a new robe, or offer some candles or some books or something. And the monks would draw lots to see who got whatever was offered. But the teacher would just give away whatever he was offered to the other monks out of compassion for the junior monks. He would just share what he had. He never took much for himself. And the young Ajahn Maha noticed that and tried to emulate it. He said, I don't want to take anything for myself, because one meal a day is enough, one set of robes is enough. I'm here to practice what the Buddha taught. So he practiced just giving away whatever was given to him and sharing it with the other monks and looking after them. He said he had one urge came up during these first few years when he was studying. He had this urge to really learn and know what the Buddha taught on a deeper level. And he realized study alone is not enough to realize the Buddha's teachings, say the Four Noble Truths. To understand how to free one's mind from suffering, one also has to meditate. So that was his aspiration that gradually formed over time. He wanted to learn meditation and go out and live quietly in the forest and improve his ability with meditation. And he realized staying in a study monastery, which is closer to the urban areas, more busy, where there's more teaching, more ceremonies, more people coming and going, he thought, this is not going to be an ideal place. So he wanted to find a meditation teacher and go out and live in the forest. And in those days, the most highly respected meditation teacher was Luang Man. So by the time he was about 6 or 7 years as a monk, he decided to go out and find Luang Man, the teacher. Similar to Luang Cha, our teacher, he decided to go off and find this great meditation master. But Luang Man was an elusive monk. He didn't make himself easily available. He moved around a lot. And in those days, much of Thailand was forest and communications were very poor. There weren't many roads or phones or anything. This is 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago. So you could only go by rumour. Ajahn Maha, he said he heard a rumour, Luang Man is in this part of Thailand. He was at that time in the 1930s and early 40s. He was up in northern Thailand. So he just followed a rumour, he's in this district, in that region, he's somewhere there, but nobody knew exactly where. So he had to walk for many days, weeks, months, up into northern Thailand from his hometown of Udon, looking for Luang Man on a kind of spiritual search. Until he found him. He found him living in a small hermitage in the mountain with just a few monks. And when he arrived there, before he even went into the monastery, he passed through the local village and he asked the way to where Luang Man's hermitage was on the side of a mountain. And the villagers said, you don't want to go there. The teacher there is really fierce. Everyone's scared of him. And he's always arguing. Ajahn Maha was puzzled. Why would he be arguing? Everyone thinks he's enlightened, which means he's totally pure, free from greed and anger. What would he have to argue about? And the day he arrived, and Ajahn Man was giving a talk when he arrived. And he heard this loud noise coming from the tiny little meditation hall. Ajahn Man was giving a talk and he was almost shouting because Ajahn Maha said he was so strong, his voice was so strong, He said his figure, his physique, he's quite slim and kind of looked a little bit fragile, but his voice was loud, very confident, and he was teaching the Dhamma with great confidence, and all the monks were sitting there in meditation, not moving, and very, very respectful, and some of them were even afraid of him because they knew he was an arahant, so they didn't want to think the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, so they were all very respectful of him. And he would give these talks, very loud, confident talks. So the villagers had misunderstood. They thought that Ajahn Mun was arguing with someone. All he was doing was teaching meditation, but just in a very direct, forceful way. So Ajahn Mahabua liked that because his character was very similar. He's very direct, very full-on, 100% sincere kind of practitioner. And so when he met Ajahn Mun, he said he just respected him as his teacher from day one. He said, this is it, this is the teacher I want. And he offered to stay there indefinitely under his guidance. He said, I'll take you as my teacher and I'll just stay here. No need to go anywhere else. And Ajahn Mun saw, the potential in the young Ajahn Mahabua and took him on as a student and started training him in meditation and the Vinaya, the discipline, the monastic discipline, which Ajahn Mun took very seriously and taught all the rules to the monks and expected them to practice all the rules. He wasn't lax, he wasn't careless, because he wanted the monks to really train themselves to let go of the mental defilements, greed, anger, delusion, and all the other different defilements human beings have. Using both the Vinaya, the monastic training, and the practice of mindfulness, and then cultivating wisdom or insight. And he's a very good, very disciplined trainer particularly of monks who lived with him. But he was a very private monk. When he finished his talk, he'd go back to his hut and do his meditation in private, and the monks wouldn't see him for a while, so they were always wondering where he was, what he's up to. So Ajahn Mahabua said when he was young, he used to spy on his teacher, just kind of quietly look and watch what he's up to, where he's meditating, what he was doing. Because he was trying to emulate him, and he wanted to just get to know his teacher. And Ajahn Mun knew that, even though he didn't say anything, he knew he was being watched by Ajahn Mahabua. And eventually he gave him the job of being his attendant monk, looking after his needs, like washing his robes, cleaning his hut for him, and carrying his bowl. And he started to trust Ajahn Mahabua because he was a very trustworthy, reliable person. And so he started to help Ajahn Mun to look after all the other monks who came to live with him as his students. And he'd often be the middle monk, intermediary between Ajahn Mun and the junior monks. And he would give instructions to the junior monks from Ajahn Mun and organize them and make sure they were looked after and practicing well, and then pass on information to Ajahn Mun, tell him what was going on and who needed help or who had a question or whatever, as well as doing his own practice. And he said later, I remember even when I was there, many years later, I went to stay with him. So I started staying with him in the 80s. He said his practice was training himself, but then also looking after the other monks for Lumpur Man. And he said he practiced in that way because he understood that's how the Buddha trained us. You help others and you help yourself. You help yourself and you help others. It's a two-way thing. And he became well known for that, for supporting the other members of the Sangha, being kind, giving them advice, and particularly for sharing what he had, the material requisites, food, robes, and other things. Because in those days, in the 1930s and 40s, monks had very few possessions. Even food was hard to come by. So it was important that Ajahn Maha was sharing and helping the others because there was so little available. And then about 1949, the last few years of Ajahn Mun's life, he went back to northeast Thailand. Ajahn Maha followed him and helped to nurse him and look after him till he died in 1949. And after he died, Ajahn Maha had this kind of insight. He said, I can either stay here looking after Ajahn Mun, build a chedi for him and look after the monks, or I can go off and practice for myself and realize what Ajahn Mun was teaching. Because he felt, I'm not enlightened yet, there's still more practice I have to do. So, out of respect for his teacher, he went off into the forest on his own. After his teacher died, not long after, he went off to practice more in the forest. And that was one of the things he told me when he came to Ajahn Chah's funeral. He said, well, now Ajahn Chah is dead, don't just hang around looking after Ajahn Chah's chedi. Go off and do your meditation, become enlightened. That's what Ajahn Chah would have encouraged you to do. And he said that's what he did. So in 1949 he went off into the hills to meditate for about 5 years and practiced in different places. And he said practicing very hard. And he said one of his main problems throughout his time as a more junior monk was that, like everyone, he would meditate and he'd have these times when his meditation was very good, mindfulness very strong, very continuous. He had a very good control of his mind, was letting go of all the distractions, peaceful, bright, aware, and then it would all disappear again. And his mind would fall back to a more normal state where all the mindfulness disappeared. He said that was his biggest suffering as a young monk, losing his samadhi, losing his mindfulness, being unable to sustain it. He'd have to come back to square one, start again. So he said that was his main obstacle and that was his main goal, is how not to lose my mindfulness. Because he became so frustrated having this experience, becoming peaceful, being mindful, and then losing it again, and losing the peace, losing the samadhi. He said sometimes he was so angry, if he could have blamed somebody else for him losing his mindfulness, he would have gone and punched them. Because he actually had been a boxer before he was a monk, and so I guess he knew about punching. And he said if he could blame someone for losing his mindfulness, he would go and punch somebody. But he couldn't. Obviously, you lose your mindfulness, that's your own fault. It's your own problem. So he said he just had to go off into the forest. He said his way of dealing with it, he'd go off into the forest even deeper away from everyone else and do sitting and walking meditation until he established his mind in firm mindfulness. And some people thought he was just angry with the world or angry with other monks or angry with someone. But he said he wasn't. He was just angry with the mental defilements, the distractions, or the mental proliferation that took his mindfulness away. He said that was his main enemy, and he got really angry when he lost his mindfulness. So he said his early practice was like a battle, a big battle between establishing mindfulness and then losing mindfulness. So he said it's like a battle between the Dhamma and the mental defilements, which distract us and confuse us and take our mindfulness away. He said one of the biggest causes for a loss of mindfulness, even when he went into the deep forest far away from everyone, was lust, sexual desire. He said that's the strongest desire human beings have. He said even when you go off into the forest to meditate, far away from people, you're hardly meeting anyone. Maybe just come out, collect your food, go back again. You still have to deal with sensual desire, sexual desire, lust, because you have memory. You'd have memories of people you knew. He still had memories of his former girlfriend who he's engaged to, and then other people he'd meet. He said he'd go on arms round, he'd see somebody, a pretty girl, and then the face would go back in his mind, back into the forest and stick there in his mind, and he'd have to learn how to let go of that attachment. He said the hardest of all, so he said he did a lot of what we call a super meditation. Super means beauty. Asupa means the unbeautiful or not beautiful. And he'd meditate on the not beauty or the not beautiful parts of the body to counter the obsession with beauty. And he said even when you're on your own, far away from anyone, you still have obsession with beauty can come up and it fills your mind. You have a thought of an old girlfriend or someone you've seen, and you see their face, you hear their voice, maybe their smell, whatever it is, their clothes, their figure, and it fills your mind and it can obsess you. And he said that was also very, very frustrating, walking up and down, meditating in the forest with images of various women coming up in his mind, even though he hadn't even seen anyone the whole day, he'd still have the memory plaguing him, bothering him. So he said he just had to keep cultivating this practice of what we call a super kammatthana, a super meditation. And if you hear his talks or read his books, that's a lot of his training for others is also in how to do this, how to contemplate the body, to see the unattractive side of the human body, and to contemplate the human body as 4 elements. Because 4 elements, when you see the body as a collection of elements, earth, air, fire, water, you realize, it's not really a self, and the sense of beauty and the identification with the beauty fades when you do that. But it's not enough just to do it once, you have to do it regularly, over and over again, and really teach yourself to see through some of your attachments to these perceptions of beauty, desire. So he spent a lot of time doing that, and he said until he had his final breakthroughs, which I think the year was maybe 1954. We know the place because we went to visit there a few years ago, Ajahn Ben's monastery. Ajahn Ben died a couple of years ago. We went to his funeral and we went to visit the very spot where Ajahn Maha became enlightened, let go of all his attachment. It's a cave on the side of the hill, they call it Wat Doi Dhammachedi, the hill of the Chedi of Dhamma. It's a very auspicious place where many monks have become enlightened and practiced meditation. And Luang Maha became enlightened there. You can still go and visit today. And he said after he got enlightened, so it's about 1954 or 55, I can't remember, he then went back to his home village, Bantat, where there was a forest, because most places had a forest around them or near them. And he settled in that forest, and that's where his final monastery grew up around him. So he spent the last sort of 50 years of his life there. He died at the age of 96, going on 97, about 10 years ago, on the 30th of January. And he lived as he taught, or he taught as he lived. He was very determined to practice what the Buddha taught, not just to study it. He was a good scholar and he became very skilled in the Pali language, but he also practiced meditation and was determined to realize the path, the fruit and enlightenment. And he had plenty of obstacles. He had some illness, injury, even right up to the very end of his life. He had one terrible injury just the last few years of his life. We'd go and visit him and he had this rotten toe his big toe became rotten and became all black and infected and pussy. And at one point you could even see through to the bone, because sometimes we'd massage him, look after him, and for a long time he wouldn't even go to the doctor for it. He said, oh yeah, this is just old karma coming back. So he seemed to be totally unattached to the pain, the suffering of having this rotten, infected toe. It seemed almost like he was using it as a teaching method for his students. So he'd sit there and you could see the big toe black and looking pretty horrible. And everyone would go, you've got to see a doctor, you've got to get this treated. And he said, oh, it's just old karma, the body is impermanent, don't get so worried about it, don't fuss so much about it. After a year or two he did go and get it treated and cleared up, but for a long time he just ignored it, he just watched it but didn't do much about it. He said it's old karma. He said when he was a young person with his father would take them out hunting, so he did kill a few animals. So it wasn't like he was perfect and didn't make any kind of bad karma when he was a layman. He did kill some animals. He did sometimes get angry, scold people when he was a layman. But he practiced to the point where he let it all go. He was a very good example of someone who has faith in the Buddha and his teachings and then devoted his whole life to practicing those teachings. And he was very kind. He took on many foreign students. Many foreigners would go and live there, become monks, or just stay in the monastery and practice. And whenever I went to stay there, he was always very kind to me, answer my questions, give me teachings, words of encouragement. And he did a huge amount for the Thai country and population as a whole. He would go around the whole of Thailand teaching Dhamma, raising funds for the economy to support all kinds of good causes, particularly like building hospitals and various charitable causes, helping the poor, various development projects, and then distributing money and food and things in very poor areas, building clinics, building dogs' homes. He built or supported one of the first dog homes in Thailand for stray dogs. Build prisons or improve the conditions of prisoners. He loved to help dogs, and if you ever went to his monastery, it was full of dogs, either stray dogs or dogs people offered him. And they say that was another characteristic of his since the time he was a child. He was always friendly, kind to dogs, would feed the dogs, play with the dogs, look after the dogs. He said one of the things his mum got really upset about, annoyed about, was he was always playing with the dogs, feeding them, looking after them. And in his monastery, there were lots of dogs, and whenever he gave his blessing, all the dogs would start howling. When you go there and you sweep the leaves, the dogs would come and help sweep the leaves with you, and when you have your cup of tea, they come and sit with you. A lot of dogs in his monastery. And of course, he was born in the year of the dog. This year is the year of the rabbit. He was born in the year of the dog. So he'd joke about that, and he'd say, oh yeah, some people think he gets angry because he'd be quite outspoken and criticize people when they behave badly. He'd say, yeah, I'm born in the year of the dog, and what the dogs do, they bite, and they bark and they bite. So he would sometimes bark at people, he'd say. Anyway, we're remembering him at this time, one of the great enlightened masters of the forest tradition. So if you get the chance to read or hear his teachings, they can be very inspiring. And he's very good at explaining about the practice all the way to Nibbana, how to let go of body, let go of mind, let go of attachment to sense of personality, a sense of self, conceit, views, all the things that cause suffering for human beings. He's very good at teaching how to see them and let go of them. So maybe I'll leave you with those reflections tonight.